I wanted to start here because this was of interest to me and Charles, as the world seemed to have now recognized years of revolution, years of standing, years of fighting, years of actually saying the things that we knew existed for centuries. For me, the publication came actually out of work we were doing in anti-Black racism training for another organization. And I said to Charles, I think we're onto something here. We use this quote a lot. We use this document by Cornel West, who is an American professor and cultural theorist. And it's from the new cultural politics of difference. And this quotation is really resonating with me as I think about the currency of what we're putting together and what is involved in the publication. It says here, there can be no artistic breakthrough or social progress without some form of crisis in civilization. A crisis usually generated by organizations or collectives that convince ordinary people to put their bodies and lives on the line. There is, of course, no guarantee that such pressure will yield the result one wants. But there is a guarantee that the status quo will remain or regress if no pressure is applied at all. And bear with me as I work through some of the pieces that I do not do on my regular life, which is to go through the pieces. Living in the Skin I'm In, Experiential Learnings, Approaches, and Consideration Towards Anti-Black Racism in the Arts is the next publication that will come out for CPAMO. And it's really exploring some of the context of Black arts presence, Black arts history, Black arts contribution to the larger context of Canadian artistic landscape, but also around anti-Black racism in the arts. It is compiled and edited by myself and Charles, and the project team will include myself, Victoria Glitzer, who is our communications manager and design person, and also Charles itself. The contributors are many. We have Regine Cadet, Nicole Bernhardt, Charles Smith, Karen Carter, Akua Delfish, Jordana Dolmek, Dan Roberts, Valerie Singh Turner, Bernard Bladden Taylor, Coco Murray, Clayton Windat, Anthony Morgan, myself, Anique Jordan, Robert Ball, Alicia Mulkin, and Dwayne Morgan. What came also from this process was the expectation that we sometimes think when we think of publication about always writing, and with an invitation to actually think about doing interviews to transcript, which offered another opportunity for us to also now amplify what will be the YouTube space with those 2 interviews. And those interviews became transcripts for the publication. And that was with Anique Jordan, Akua Delfish, and Bernard Bladden Taylor. Its table of contents. Section 1 is looking at culture, racism, and the Black history. And it's using articles that we've used in many other publications. Clayton Windat, who speaks about cultural mediation, a brief paper for organizations to reach those not currently represented. Nicole Bernhardt's contribution around no offense, but I'm going to talk about racism, resituating anti-racism within the diversity lexicon, and why equity-driven organizations must continue to talk about race. Anthony Morgan does an interesting and beautiful work about Black people in Canada not being settlers. Section 2 is Living in the Skin I'm In and Narratives. Charles and I, in doing the work around anti-Black racism, realized that we were Black facilitators, strategists, and sometimes in some organization, in some ways, we arrived at conflict. Though the intention of senior management might be good, those working within the organization were always pushing back. And I realized in that moment that the pushback probably came because they were now confronted with looking and relating to 2 Black men number one, but two Black persons holding information for which they felt they did have, but didn't have in the same perspectives. So it's really the narratives of this particular space. Charles and I contribute this thing around 5 questions, which is also part of how the Living Reels, that's a part of the conference, came into being. And we responded to 5 questions separately. And it was my work and task to put those 5 questions together into that particular article. Regine Cadet, who will be speaking with me later, speaks around the value of our art. And Karen Carter, who did this article for the Toronto Star, talks very, very frankly about what it means to be an ally. Section 3 was around this idea of holding space, histories, perspectives, and forms. The concept of holding space for me was, in what ways have Black creative been holding, shaping, moving through space? In what ways they question space, held space for others without naming it. We have words like mentorship. We have words that are in a different ways in which we've been holding space and supporting space. And Akua Delfish, who will be a part of the panel, will talk about the ways, in some of those ways in which mentorship looked different for Black artists, Black organizations, because we never labeled it as mentorship. The moments in Scarborough when you say, come, sit down here beside me and put a drum and start to drum was mentorship, but it was never labeled as such, because the perspective of how we think about space is different. Can anything define the ways Black artists hold space? The publication becomes a medium for archiving the histories, the stories, and also the perspective of some of the ways in which Black artists are engaging in space. So this section I'm calling Holding Space looks then at visual performance and community arts practices through a contribution from Anik and Akua that will look at culture, commodity, and the crossroads. Black Canadian artists in conversation with navigating the arts. What are the many ways in which they're thinking about it? Holding Space 2 is about Black Canadian music history. It offers a piece by Robert Ball, who's 6th generation Canadian, but also having Jamaican parentage, around ours. And we're still finding a name for Brainerd Blyden Taylor's contribution with his beautiful work over the years with the Nathaniel Death Chorale. Holding Space 3 is around dancing in divides. It starts with a piece by American and Alicia Mulkin, who looks at systemic racism in dance. It continues with a piece that I was invited to do by CBC Arts. That piece had to be shortened. And my question there was, why in an online space should the piece be shortened? But it was looking at dance's critical awakening after 2020 and what visioning we could consider as we move forward into 2021 and beyond. There's also contributions from Coco Colette Murray around a cycle of cultural longevity and what it means to actually understand longevity for cultural practices, in this case, dance. And that section ends with a piece, A Time for Change. Jordana Domek is actually one of the principal, a dancer in the National Ballet. And it talks about her work with going back to the States and doing some work there with the Dance USA and in Philadelphia, and also now doing some work with the EDI Committee for the National Ballet of Canada. Holding Space 4, we'll be looking at theater, how theater is really understood beyond the gaze. It has a piece that was a critique around how critics and persons can begin to look at epoch representations in the arts, and in particular theater. Diane Roberts did an amazing keynote in our December gathering, and she'll be looking at weaving the ways of knowing. The final section is Holding Space, intersections of speaking about writing and race. And Dwayne Morgan is also here as a speaker to talk about his contribution, art and race, but what it might mean for him as an artist who've been very instrumental in actually what spoken word has become across the country. It ends with also Valerie Singh Turner, who's a part of Culture View out in the West, and her role in creating a digital archive, and also as part of our digital literacy program, a digital archive for epoch artists. Forging Solidarity Through Digital Technology is the title of that section. And she does a really interesting piece on a meditative piece around the intersections of anti-Black racism, technology, and intercultural solidarity. And it's a beautiful piece that will also arrive in the session as well. I'll stop sharing here and I'll invite the panelists to just speak on what it might mean to be a Black artist. I want to invite Regine first to talk about her intersections with being French, an immigrant, Canadian, who have worked both in the Montreal space and also in the Toronto space. She's the president for TAPA, and she's also the general manager at Theatre Passe Muraille. Regine?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kevin, for inviting me. So I think you kind of made all the introduction about who I was. So yes, I immigrated came from Haiti in '99 and started working in Montreal in the art sector in 2001. And as a newcomer, it was difficult to establish myself as an arts leader. I also have to say that I also started working at the May Montreal Art Intercultural as an arts administrator, and then found my way through as the artistic director and executive director. So I would say it was a huge challenge for me to lead an organization for the first time in Canada. And it was very stressful as a Black woman. And I would say that for sure, I think as Black women, we have that tendency of maybe not having enough confidence to, put ourselves out there. So it was a true challenge. And also I was a dancer in Haiti, and I was already traveling internationally with a dance company. And when I came to Montreal, it was very surprising to me that a city where there's the biggest Haitian population, that there were no real known dance company around. There was probably one group that I knew of, but there was not a big, well-known company, and not really also within the sector where I was working in, because technically I was the executive director of an institution that is opening doors for culturally diverse artists, but at the same time, I was having my artistic career, but I was kind of compartmentalizing things. I was in one space, I was the administrator, and the other, I was the artist, but I was evolving in my Haitian community. So it's like I like we were talking yesterday about code switching. So on one side, I was the administrator, and trying to shine and succeed, and then getting my way through the grant writing and everything else. And on the other side, I was this artist that was kind of working in the shadow but doing my thing. It's like people in my work didn't know what I was doing on my dance or in my Haitian community. So it's like I had two lives. And I would say that now I kind of regret, in a sense, not putting the two together. And I encourage people not to make that that mistake, and kind of I think I had my success in my Haitian community, and I was doing a lot of advocacy work. I was involved in teaching, giving dance classes for youth, for elders. I was involved in associations, and I created my own dance company. And as I said in my text, I was able to fill a whole house with 300 people without really tapping into the government funding, even though as an arts administrator, I actually knew how to do it. And yeah, it's kind of a weird situation. And what I found interesting actually this morning, what Paulina was saying about, is it wrong to not actually get funding? Maybe it's good also to auto-produce, which is what I actually did. And I came from a country where government funding doesn't support the arts really, and art is really considered a hobby, not really a career. So I think I came here with the same mindset. So I wanted to do my dance. I created my company. I auto-produced my shows, and my community helped me. And I kind of continued with that same mindset. But at the same time, thinking about it, I would say, well, I have the skills to get the funding. Why the hell don't you apply for yourself to get that money too? So also in my document, I also talked about the perception of what is Afro contemporary or Afro dance and what is considered professional or not. So I sat on many councils, juries, and I know for a fact that most Afro contemporary or companies were considered traditional or unprofessional, or had to seek mentorship. And so that kind of took me back a little bit, and kind of I didn't want necessarily to go through this. And again, I was like, who's to say what's professional or not, and who's to say what is the quality of the work that is deemed to be funded. So
thank you.
Let's start with that.
Yeah, I think you're setting the stage, and I'm starting here and working my way back. And I think there's something interesting about the idea of code switching that was mentioned, but also the multiple hats that I think Black artists work in, the multiple ways that we do work that sometimes is not being understood as part of the larger context of a funding body or the systems. For me, there's something really interesting, and I again, the publication is providing such interest to me, because I've been thinking for the past years around this idea of like the erasure of Black cultural arts presence, and where does it come from? And I want to move to Duane, because I think Duane and I have a long history together in this idea of developing from teen days, right? This idea of building a practice and what the practice has meant. And I know he's gone into many spaces for running for office, for being, for having what was then something that started in a location like Scarborough, in Malvern, to be exact, to amplifying it for the city, in terms of then amplifying it nationally, amplifying it in a North American perspective. But sometimes I feel that there is an erasure of that work. And I hope that, for me, the publication is also then amplifying voices in different ways. And it's not complete. I'd love to do a part 2 to this. Duane, this is a conversation. So I'm just bringing you into to talk about that sort of trajectory that people may not understand from back then. I mean, I'm thinking about it right now, and I'm like, Tanisha Scott came out of that particular experience. Tanisha is like, Get Busy is now in LA. Tamla Matthews and I were there. Debbie Nichols Skirt was there. There's Keisha Wentz, who's a musician, with there. There's so many people that you contributed to in that idea. Walk me from the idea from the roots to where you are now, and what your contribution to the publication may have meant for you.
So first of all, thank you so much for the invite to share and to be a part of the publication. So I started an organization, collective called Up From the Roots back in 1994. And I started it because there were, as a young person, as a teenager, there were really no opportunities. When I discovered that I could write I wasn't welcome at the open mics because it was the capital P poets, and they didn't like what this young Black kid with these rhymes had to say. That wasn't poetry to them. So there was doors closed everywhere. And I had so many friends who were rappers, singers, dancers, who also had no space. So I decided to create space. And I would find places wherever, and you would know this, probably Akua would know this as well. You know, one of the first really big popular shows I used to produce was a show called Black Love, and it had a live band. And imagine all these young people showing up. Everybody's in dress pants, everybody's in shirt. The guys are in shirt and tie coming out to watch the arts, but it was in a Fit for Life gym. And that was the only space I could get. So here we were all dressed up, watching the art, and then you look to your left, there's people on a treadmill, all sorts of stuff happening. And it's like, but that was the space that we could get. And you look around and there was just a sea of hundreds of young Black people just here enjoying themselves, consuming this art. And for me, it was just really important to find ways to bring art to the community. And that has been something that I've done in so many different ways, from, you know, comedians, musicians. Once I know that you're an artist, I'm always looking for ways to see how I can amplify what it is that you're doing. So that has been what my journey has been, primarily with spoken word since '94. But as you said, I've incorporated dance and music and all of these other elements into what I do. And I think with the piece that I wrote, there's another piece that I wrote just for myself last year, which was a 4-part piece on the gentrification of spoken word, and just kind of looking at, you know, as a Black artist, you do this work, you make something cool, popular, and then other people say, oh, wow, that's so cool. I wish I could have that just without all the Black stuff, just without all the politics, just without the urgency. So then you have people who don't look like you getting up on stage, talking about all sorts of stuff that, you know, to me is not pressing, not relevant, but they can copy the form and people can digest it because it doesn't have the Blackness. The Blackness is a bit too bitter, too sour for the palate of a lot of the people who think that this stuff is cool. So, you know, in the piece that I wrote for the publication, looking at art and race, you know, I wanted to kind of caution people around the idea of, you know, all of these organizations now are looking at diversity and inclusion, and how do we, you know, incorporate all of these people and all of these, you know, other artists and diverse artists. But we should definitely try to avoid seeing that as success. Being included shouldn't be a sign of success for us. We still need to have space where we speak how we speak to the people who understand what we do. And the example that I used in the piece was talking about the Negro Leagues of baseball. And I don't know how many people are, you know, follow sports, but in the Negro Leagues of baseball, the Negro Leagues were the supreme, most athletic brand of baseball that was happening in North America. But it wasn't the major leagues. And the major leagues, where all the white people played, was, you know, where the big money was and stuff. And when Jackie Robinson was brought into the major leagues, we saw this as our success. Finally, we made it into the major leagues. And shortly after that, the Negro Leagues fell apart. So all of the stadiums that were owned by Black people went out of business. All of the parking lots owned by Black people went out of business. All of the athletes that never got drafted into major leagues now were unemployed. And we run the same risk as artists when our idea of success is just being included into something because people know we bring a superior brand of whatever it is that we are doing, because as you said, you know, we know how to do all sides of it. We don't just do this one thing. We know all of the different components because we had no choice but to learn all of the different components of everything that we do. So the minute somebody creates space and allows us in, if we believe that to be success, we are completely selling ourselves short and missing out.
Wow. All right. Dwayne Morgan is in the house. We're just warming up. And, you know, you've mentioned a really interesting point there that I'm smiling because I'm realizing that now the publication is offering space to actually connect larger ideas about things that have been working within the system and the ways. For me, what was really beautiful and really targeted was making sure that we had arts administrators, you know, people who've built the communities of practice, but also a younger generation and a younger voice who probably have benefited from that that work, you know. And I just realized that I'm locating Malvern a lot in this conversation, and I don't know why. You know, I don't know why, but we're going to stay in Malvern. And I want to introduce Akua Delfish to the conversation. Akua actually was one of the persons that really shifted a lot of things for me in the publication around the need to understand the complexities of how mentorship happens, how young leaders take place, but more importantly, how they are part of a larger contribution to something in moving sort of the Afrofuturistic way of looking at either the influence that they've received from others, other leaders, and or the experiences they have from those particular spaces, moving it forward in another way. That it doesn't have to be the same way, it can be in a different way, and it's okay. So welcome, Akua.
Hello, hello, hello. So I guess for everyone here, I'll add a little context of my journey and how that speaks to me being a Black artist. Even saying artist out loud being a term that I've grappled with in terms of claiming it, knowing that I am an artist, but always having, you know, another job, another goal in mind, having challenges, internal challenges with centering art in my world as a thing that I could do and live off of it completely, etc. So always feeling like I have two worlds. And, you know, at work, I say in my other world. And when I'm doing art stuff, I say in my day world. So it's like, you know, having, struggling with that challenge of feeling like I can do both, or I could have followed one, wholeheartedly. So I say that to say, so for myself, my background and where I push this conversation from, which involved Anik, as Kevin talked about, is that I've been a dancer for years, but more than a dancer. And I've almost separated my life, as I said, even in the arts world, where I was a musician for years as well. I can play about 5 different instruments. I still do play the steel pan. I've done photography as well. I'm trained in photography. I went to school for visual arts, but a lot of these things are in their different circles, and I've always separated them for the audiences that I think would appreciate my level of skill or would see me as an artist in that element based on what they deemed as appropriate training. Right. And so I say when appropriate training goes into, I guess, even my dance world. So for me, my specialty would be Afro-Caribbean folklore. And that's because I started from the age of 5, as Kevin was talking about, in in a group that's in Scarborough in Malvern, where they're teaching us, we're being taught by those who migrated to Canada or individuals who were born here, such as Kevin, such as like people like Karen, I'm trying to think of Karen Donaldson, et cetera, along with individuals like Kevin and Tamla who grew up here, and they've essentially learned the art form authentically from other individuals, and we're learning from them as they're learning in the same space, et cetera, but learning in authentic ways, the cultural practices, right? And learning that from 5 years old, going into high school, going into university, I've always struggled with this idea of whether or not I was enough of a dancer, because I wasn't in a studio dancing, to take that on professionally. So I know throughout high school, I did arts abundantly. Like I said, I went to high school for the arts. And then when I was about to go into university, I'm looking at things like accounting, et cetera, right? And then I hit that point. I said, no, luckily I have very supportive parents, not because I felt like anyone ever told me I could continue the arts, but I went into doing fine arts cultural studies. Literally at the last minute, decided I'm going to do fine arts cultural studies. Went into that area at York University, and it's a very unique program. It doesn't actually exist anymore, but it was a very unique program at the time that allowed us to use all of the different, to get a Bachelor of Arts program, but use all of the different art forms, you know, for someone like me that's into everything, use all the different art forms and find ways to articulate what they do, similar to some of the discussions in this publication, what those art forms do to push society, to question society, et cetera, but looking at them critically using cultural studies as the base. But throughout that experience as well, again, still looking around, looking at the dance program, how many Black girls are actually in the dance program? What was their background? Could I have done dance still? Oh no, maybe not. Always questioning whether or not in my practices, if I was enough of an artist to, follow this wholeheartedly, to be deemed as a dancer the way some of the others might have claimed that title. Moving beyond now my undergrad, similarly, I thought I was going to go into law, and then I'm like, I still have this love for cultural criticism, cultural studies, the arts. I go into communications, culture, and technology. Again, using arts. No matter where I go, it doesn't matter what I'm studying. I'm using arts as the foundation to discuss politics, to discuss changes in society, social change, etc. So arts staying the core of who I am, but yet I'm always grappling with this idea of calling myself an artist, and I'm working in all the art forms. I'm critiquing it. I'm studying it. I'm using this to do major presentations, but still having trouble accepting that title for myself. And there was something that Regine noted in terms of like, Regine touched on it, and I believe Dwayne touched on it as well. Just this idea of feeling like whether or not that environment allows you to feel like you're a part of the rest of the arts world. I think Regine talked about she never sought funding because she didn't feel like the work she was doing, like maybe she had to push it along herself instead of, feeling like the art boards would support it or deem it as, the type of work that they fund or support, etc. But not necessarily because someone else told us that was the situation, but that's the way we were meant to feel about the work that we were doing in the art and the art that we're doing, especially when it's cultural. So now I am the co-founder and even saying this title, I guess, co-executive director of D-Life Dance Company, as well as we've now, my business partner and I have now founded Go Left Creatives, where we are looking at commodifying what we do, even some of the artistic direction that we do. And to get to that point was a challenge. So starting the dance company was a challenge, like, can we do this? Am I qualified enough to do this? And imagine I'm questioning this after all of my training, et cetera, whether or not, and the years of dance, if I'm authorized enough to start a dance company, how will it be seen? Will it be seen as a community project or a community dance company, or a dance company where youth can come and also develop their skills to become professional dancers? So a lot of the work, I think that also inspired a lot of the work that we tried to do with D-Life, which is when we are now talking about cultural arts, because we still base it a lot on Caribbean styles in terms of how we are teaching and talking and interacting with the kids, rooted in Caribbean styles, but showing them also where there are intersections with some of the stuff that they're doing now. And when I say now, meaning like some of the more urban styles that they're doing, and showing that they don't have to exist in two separate spaces, that this way of moving can influence that way of moving, and how they do influence one another, but also beyond just the art forms, looking at the ways in which, we were seeing this gap. My business partner, Onika, comes from, and some of you may know her, she's the artistic director right now for Vibe Arts, but how there's this commercial arts world, and then there's this cultural arts world, and they don't seem to interact with one another. It's like if you're doing cultural arts, you continue and you belong to the community. If you're doing studio or commercial arts, you continue this way, and maybe you're hired for, or you receive the funding, or you're accepted in certain spaces, or you get certain titles. But over here, you are what's keeping the community together and keeping the culture alive, etc. But they don't meet one another. So just doing some of that work with D-Life as well, to try to bridge those two, or let them see they're not as isolated as one, or they don't have to be as isolated as one would imagine, because what we found so far is that even exposing the young people to some of those opportunities that are normally attached to typical type dance studios has allowed at least 2 of our dancers that have now arrived at the university level to continue with the arts. Right? And heavily inspired by the way that we've exposed them to realizing that art was something they could continue, and they could take their cultural arts understanding and love and use that as part of the work that they're doing now in university. So just really, for me, trying to change that mindset, those are a lot of the discussions I've had, at least for myself, around arts and being a Black artist, as well as yeah, just claiming that title for myself and what it looks like in terms of mentorship. Just to touch on that, Kevin, you talked about, for me, I've been doing mentorship. Whether I called it that, not necessarily, but I've been doing mentorship, but I never saw it as that because our culture, it's automatic. It's part of our practice. I've been doing intersectionality. And I know that if I sit down and do a paper, I think about that. If you ask me one-on-one, just as a person doing what I'm doing, I don't attach the two. Like I said, I separate them. I don't attach the two or connect the two, but everything we do in our culture, we have multiple interdisciplinary. We have multiple arts happening at the same time. The drummer has to understand the dancer has to understand the costuming, the symbolism. There's always that happening. Now, when I go to translate that for an arts board, why don't I connect it in the same way? You know, why isn't it defined for me in those terms? Because for me, that is just part of the culture. That is part of the way we process. I don't have these titles or these classifications, which again is another challenge to communicate that. And just some of those challenges we have with, you know, translating what we do into how someone else can understand it, or I should say not someone else, how these boards or organizations, these funders can understand it I guess.
And I want to just say that it's beautiful to talk about the dualities of spaces. You know, it's not just dual. I think there's many spaces in many ways in which that I'm hearing that we've been working in is not understood contextually, because it's then asked of us to speak to ourselves only in one particular context of things.
Exactly.
Right? I'm an administrator, and I should speak as Kevin the administrator without speaking about Kevin the artistic director. And you're like, well, those two things combine. And so the rich things I'm reading in the publication are exactly those particular things. And I purposefully are looking at this idea of dualities and moving back and forward. And I must honor that there are certain persons and people who have built and supported, again, this thing about the erasure and what the publication is hoping to achieve is like, your father is Eric Delfish. Your father is an integral part of what we know as Caribbean as a festival.
Yes.
So those dualities of complexities of things in terms of how Black people have been contributing to the landscape of Canadian artistic expression is really, really interesting to me. And I started where I did, and I'm ending up here because I want to invite Brainerd Blyden Taylor to come into the conversation, simply because the name alone, we were in our conversation, the name alone of his chorale is an honoring of someone that has contributed musically to the landscape. But he will tell you about some of the challenges and the complexities that is involved in even that particular relationship. Brainerd, come true. Welcome.
Thank you for having me and having us all as part of this conversation, my brother. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel honored to be sharing space with all of you. It's there are threads in all of the conversations that have happened so far about the whole idea of this holding space, and who are we, and how is the work that we do recognized. You know, I was born in the Caribbean. I was exposed to a few different things in the Caribbean. You know, some of the folk traditions of the Caribbean, but also some of the more Euroclassical aspects of my art form, music making. And then I moved to Canada, and as I began to try and ply my trade here, begun to sort of feel a sort of disconnection, and begin to ask myself, even in those early years, where do I belong? Where do I fit in to this whole picture? And you know, what I've eventually ended up doing and trying to create with the Nathaniel Dett Chorale has been an interesting one, because I mean, so much of it is rooted in the Euroclassical forms of education, and yet at the same time, what we've been trying to do has been to throw up to ourselves and others the variety of styles and tradition, and the difficulties that we run into in terms of making this self-evident. You were talking about erasure, and sometimes it seems as though the more we do, the less we seem to be making in terms of headway. So I realized that as the burden of trying to create an organization like the one that I lead is how to articulate that to people. How do folks understand what this is? Almost 25 years ago, when I sort of said I want an organization that performs Afrocentric choral music, people are saying, well, what is that exactly? Well, what does that mean? What do you mean by Afrocentric? And I found myself trying to define, did I mean music of Black composers? Did I mean, music that had been influenced by, the panoply of African descended traditions? Yes. Do I mean something that sort of informs us about our ethos, our place, our way of being in the world? All of these things. And it just seemed like one kept butting one's head against certain walls. Like some of the other folks that have spoken already, I found myself working in the arts sector, working on different arts councils, being part of, and trying to create space for folks like myself and others, and seeing where the difficulties were in sort of paving that road, if you will, time and time again. And I think back to the person that I've named my ensemble after. Here's a man who was born and raised and educated in Canada initially, went to the United States and became the first person of his ilk to graduate with first-class honors in piano, organ, and composition. As a conductor, as a poet, I mean, a true Renaissance man and someone way ahead of his time. And yet he was not welcome back here in Canada. There were no institutions of higher learning that would recognize his achievements and say, hey, you have something to teach and contribute in this regard. And, so he finds voice for that, in the historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. But it was time for Canadians to be aware of some of this heritage, and still is. And I realized that, again, in some of the other organizations that I would join, like our provincial bodies and our national bodies, as far as persons of African heritage were concerned, and I would join those things, and I'd be the only person that looked like me. And it was like, oh my God. What, how do I keep doing this? How do I keep forging ahead in this regard? And then realizing that a lot of this work, a lot of this music, these are things that were not being taught in our institutions of higher education. So I could go to the University of Toronto, I could study music, and I would be taught the European canon. But a lot of the other musics that I was doing in my church or wanting to do, from my own artistic endeavor and inspiration, those things were not being taught. And so that was really the kind of thing that gave me the impetus to say, this needs to be done. People look at me and say, well, that was an amazing career move. No, I'm not doing this because it's a career move. I'm doing this because, you know what? It's not being done, and we need to do this, and we need to create the space to do this. I looked at one of our provincial youth choir, and I see a number of the kids who are performing there. How many of them are African descended? And when I finally get asked to conduct this choir, all of a sudden I realized the importance of representing and being there and planting a flag. All of a sudden, 7 or 8 young people of African heritage come out of the woodworks to audition for an organization that they didn't feel they were welcome at, or if they had come forward, that they would have been given the opportunity to participate in. And I look back now and I see some of those same young people who, have their doctorates and leading the way in other areas. And one in particular has just finally been appointed Director of Choral Activities at the University of Toronto. I'm so thrilled about this. And yet, when I talk to my brother, and say, how did this come about? He goes, well, I was encouraged to put my name forward. And I said no. And I said, well, why did you say no? Well, I'd never be given that job. Even in this day, he would say something like that. However, all of us who have been on this call so far, myself included, need to feel proud that we have been sort of paving the way and leading the charge so that young people like that can step into these roles and again create more space for others who are coming behind us.
Thank you so much. There's this beautiful thing about holding space, but there's also something about the ways in which Black arts document, right? That our bodies is documentation, our voice, our speech, our attitudes, the cultural nuances of the documentation. I'm really excited about the publication in so many regards because I think it also puts a different way of thinking about what documentation can look like for, as you mentioned, Bernard, the future. And the next generation of participants who will understand there's a larger history at play in this country, that despite maybe challenges of being erased or visibly erased or not erased in terms of knowledge,
yes,
there are also a bunch of artists that are moving, arts administrators, ADs, poets,
yes,
that are moving the conversation forward in different ways.
yes.
So I'm mindful of the time we have and your contributions, but I just want to go around and I just want to, if we could offer, this idea of Afrofuturism is really interesting for me, and what this one thing that we would want to contribute to the future selves or future beings as artists, as creatives, as administrators, but also to the future generations. What would that possibly one thought thing be? And I'll start with Akua.
Yikes. Not yikes. The one thing for me, and it's going to seem very simple, but I think I mentioned this as well in the publication, collaboration, but true collaboration, not just with those who seem like where the collaboration seems automatic and it seems natural, but collaborating with those that you wouldn't imagine that you could find intersections, right? Because a lot of times you'll be surprised what you can learn from one another. Collaboration between sectors, collaboration between art forms, etc. I find that the more that we step outside of what we, like seeing what we do as only belonging to certain groups or certain spaces, we learn so much. I've seen that. I mean, Dwayne said I've followed his work for years, and I've seen that the minute that he explores new ways of thinking of poetry, right? And that won't come from following what everyone else is doing or other spaces that have existed before him. It comes from looking at other sectors or other groups, other styles, and being influenced by them to see what elements can I take, and not to steal, but just to help you rethink the way you're looking at what you do, right? And I think across the board collaboration, but like authentic, serious collaboration, no holdbacks. You can learn so much. And I think that's where the growth is for the arts in general, especially a lot of Black art.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump over to Bernard.
Yeah, I would agree with our sister Akua. Collaboration is very important, and it's one of the things that we've tried to do, not just in choral music or vocal music, but working with dance, or working with visual arts, and not only with organizations, African descended organizations, but with others. And I'm grateful that this moment in which we're living now has sort of, again, opened some of the doors for people to want to have these conversations with us. We've been here, we've been doing the work for quite a while. But, particularly in the art form in which I'm endeavoring to make some headway. I remember when I was first asked to work on the Toronto Arts Council, and I was asked to do that because A, I was Black, and because B, I was good, so I was told. But more importantly, they wanted me to sort of speak to the Black community. And I had to tell them, no one person can do that. I can't speak to the Black community for you. There are Black communities, even those of us who are African descended, we have to, we talk about the African diaspora, the African diasporas, there are many. And so one of the things that we want to do through this medium of music is to try and endeavor to even have African descended peoples be less siloed, and we need to sort of do that within and among ourselves. We need to be talking to each other. We need to be sharing space with each other. We need to be building bridges of understanding between ourselves, because there's a unity there that we need to embrace, a unity that is, firmly anchored in our diversity. And as we do that, I think we can share that more with the other. So that's one of the things that I would like to keep doing, and invite those who are coming behind to do even more of.
Thank you so much for that. I think you segued beautifully into Regine, because of course you talk about communities and varying communities of Blackness.
Exactly. I think, as you said, for sure, Francophones, new immigrant, second generation, it's very different. The one thing I would say, yes, collaboration for sure. Again, this actually is making me aware of people I would want to collaborate with, mainly Akua, for example. I was like, oh, it's interesting. I would like to talk more with Akua, but I would say also participation and putting ourselves out there. And we keep saying their boards, these foundations, and why aren't we on these boards? Why aren't we on these juries? And why aren't we telling them what assets we represent? I am totally aware now that, yes, I'm a Black woman, I'm Francophone, I'm living in Ontario. I have people are calling me because I have the two official languages. They need me. I have background in dance. I have background in administration, in theater. So we have to put ourselves out there and tell them about what we bring to the table. I think that's really, really important.
Thank you so much. And
I'm just going to jump in here very quick and say, yesterday I was on a different conference and I was listening to Trabian Shorter's talk about asset framing. We need to check that out. This is what we all need to be doing, asset framing. We need to help change the narrative so that people get where this is coming from.
Thank you so much for that. And this idea of putting ourselves out there, I'm purposefully ending with Dwayne, because I often wonder, and I remember being in we're creating newsletter and all these things to mail things out. That was a moment when in our teens, Dwayne had an idea and he placed himself out there with a vision, with an idea. And so what would you want to offer now as you look at your career? What do you want to put out there?
I think it actually builds on what Regine was just saying. And I think, when we get invited into space, I think we have to put up wallpaper in the space. It's not enough to just be in the space, but we have to be unforgettable in the space. We have to claim the space. So just even as a quick example, when I moved my When Brothers Speak show to the St. Lawrence Center for the Arts, my audience had never gone into this theater ever. They had no reason to go there. There was nothing that looked like them that happened in this place. And for the people who worked at the theater, they had never seen all these young Black people come to this theater ever. Now, it's part of their policy, a show starts at 8. By 8:15, their front of house people are checking everything off, gone home, whatever. And after the first event, I had to say, here's how this works. If the show starts at 8, unfortunately, half of my audience is going to show up between 8:15 and 8:30. If you don't have somebody at the door, it's going to be chaos. So we had to work with them and say, when I come here, these are how the rules have to change for the audience that I'm bringing here. It's not a matter of, this is how we do things and you just fit in. It's no, my audience who's coming has a different set of expectations, operates very different. How can we work together so that when they come, they get the same experience and treatment as the other people who normally would come there? And we were able to this day, create a great working relationship where, I say to them, hey, here's what to expect. And they, book the staff necessary to make that happen. Have somebody stay later from front of house for all the people who are late, and they have all the names down there and get them in and get them to the seat. So I think it's never just enough to be able to be in space, but we have to claim the space and make the space reflective of who we are.
Thank you. And that's why I'm even smiling some more about holding space. You have to claim it, We have to go in there, you have to hold this place, And your pot will have to come out, and your train have to come out, and the rotate will have to come out, and the Creole have to come out, right? And everything have to come out, because this is the way we actually hold space. I want to say thank you, because also the other parts of the publication is actually looking at, there's a whole bibliography from different books and articles and different approaches specific to Black arts expressions, but also there's a section on terms, CPAMO, so that's the work we do.